Stepan Arkadyevich sat in Karenin's study listening to his report on the causes of the unsatisfactory position of Russian finance, and only waiting for the moment when he would finish to speak about his own business or about Anna. "Yes, that's very true," he said, when Alexey Alexandrovich took off the pince-nez, without which he could not read now, and looked inquiringly at his former brother-in-law. "That's very true in particular cases, but still the principle of our day is freedom." "Yes, but I lay down another principle, embracing the principle of freedom," said Alexey Alexandrovich, with emphasis on the word embracing, and he put on his pince-nez again, so as to read the passage in which this statement was made. And turning over the beautifully written, wide-margined manuscript, Alexey Alexandrovich read aloud over again the conclusive passage. "I don't advocate protection for the sake of private interests, but for the public weal, and for the lower and upper classes equally," he said, looking over his pince-nez at Oblonsky. "But they cannot grasp that, they are taken up now with personal interests, and carried away by phrases." Stepan Arkadyevich knew that when Karenin began to talk of what they were doing and thinking, the persons who would not accept his report and were the cause of everything wrong in Russia, that it was coming near the end. And so now he eagerly abandoned the principle of free trade, and fully agreed. Alexey Alexandrovich paused, thoughtfully turning over the pages of his manuscript. "Oh, by the way," said Stepan Arkadyevich, "I wanted to ask you, sometime when you see Pomorsky, to drop him a hint that I should be very glad to get that new appointment of Secretary of the Committee of the Amalgamated Agency of the Southern Railways and Banking Companies." Stepan Arkadyevich was familiar by now with the title of the post he coveted, and he brought it out rapidly without mistake. Alexey Alexandrovich questioned him as to the duties of this new committee, and pondered. He was considering whether the new committee would not be acting in some way contrary to the views he had been advocating. But as the influence of the new committee was of a very complex nature, and his views were of very wide application, he could not decide this straight off, and taking off his pince-nez, he said, Of course, I can mention it to him, but what is your reason precisely for wishing to obtain the appointment? It's a good salary, rising to 9,000, and my means. 9,000. Repeated Alexei Alexandrovich, and he frowned. The high figure of the salary made him reflect that on that side Stepan Arkadyevitch's proposed position ran counter to the main tendency of his own projects of reform, which always leaned towards economy. I consider, and I have embodied my views in a note on the subject, that in our day these immense salaries are evidence of the unsound economic _ossiet_ of our finances. But what's to be done? Said Stepan Arkadyevitch. Suppose a bank director gets 10,000, well, he's worth it, or an engineer gets 20,000 after all, it's a growing thing, you know. I assume that a salary is the price paid for a commodity, and it ought to conform with the law of supply and demand. If the salary is fixed without any regard for that law, as, for instance, when I see two engineers leaving college together, both equally well trained and efficient, and one getting 40,000 while the other is satisfied with 2, or when I see lawyers and hussars, having no special qualifications, appointed directors of banking companies with immense salaries, I conclude that the salary is not fixed in accordance with the law of supply and demand, but simply through personal interest. And this is an abuse of great gravity in itself, and one that reacts injuriously on the government service. I consider. Stepan Arkadyevitch made haste to interrupt his brother-in-law. Yes, but you must agree that it's a new institution of undoubted utility that's being started. After all, you know, it's a growing thing. What they lay particular stress on is the thing being carried on honestly, said Stepan Arkadyevitch with emphasis. But the Moscow significance of the word honest was lost on Alexei Alexandrovich. Honesty is only a negative qualification, he said. Well, you'll do me a great service, anyway, said Stepan Arkadyevitch, by putting in a word to Pomorsky just in the way of conversation. But I fancy it's more in Bulgarov's hands, said Alexei Alexandrovich. Bulgarov has fully assented, as far as he's concerned, said Stepan Arkadyevitch, turning red. Stepan Arkadyevitch reddened at the mention of that name, because he had been that morning at the Jew Volgarinov's, and the visit had left an unpleasant recollection. Stepan Arkadyevitch believed most positively that the committee in which he was trying to get an appointment was a new, genuine, and honest public body, but that morning when Volgarinov had intentionally, beyond a doubt, kept him 2 hours waiting with other petitioners in his waiting room, he had suddenly felt uneasy. Whether he was uncomfortable that he, a descendant of Rurik, Prince Oblonsky, had been kept for 2 hours waiting to see a Jew, or that for the first time in his life he was not following the example of his ancestors in serving the government, but was turning off into a new career, anyway he was very uncomfortable. During those 2 hours in Volgarinov's waiting room, Stepan Arkadyevitch, stepping jauntily about the room, pulling his whiskers, entering into conversation with the other petitioners, and inventing an epigram on his position, assiduously concealed from others, and even from himself, the feeling he was experiencing. But all the time he was uncomfortable and angry. He could not have said why, whether because he could not get his epigram just right, or from some other reason. When at last Volgarinov had received him with exaggerated politeness and unmistakable triumph at his humiliation, and had all but refused the favor asked of him, Stepan Arkadyevitch had made haste to forget it all as soon as possible. And now, at the mere recollection, he blushed. Chapter 18. Now there is something I want to talk about, and you know what it is. About Anna, Stepan Arkadyevitch said, pausing for a brief space, and shaking off the unpleasant impression. As soon as Oblonsky uttered Anna's name, the face of Alexey Alexandrovitch was completely transformed, all the life was gone out of it, and it looked weary and dead. What is it exactly that you want from me? He said, moving in his chair and snapping his pince nez. A definite settlement, Alexey Alexandrovitch, some settlement of the position. I'm appealing to you, not as an injured husband, Stepan Arkadyevitch was going to say, but afraid of wrecking his negotiation by this, he changed the words, not as a statesman, which did not sound _apropos_, but simply as a man, and a good-hearted man and a Christian. You must have pity on her, he said. That is, in what way precisely? Karenin said softly. Yes, pity on her. If you had seen her as I have been spending all the winter with her, you would have pity on her. Her position is awful, simply awful. I had imagined, answered Alexey Alexandrovich in a higher, almost shrill voice, that Anna Arkadyevna had everything she had desired for herself. Oh, Alexey Alexandrovich, for heaven's sake, don't let us indulge in recriminations. What is past, and you know what she wants and is waiting for divorce. But I believe Anna Arkadyevna refuses a divorce, if I make it a condition to leave me my son. I replied in that sense, and supposed that the matter was ended. I consider it at an end, shrieked Alexey Alexandrovich. But, for heaven's sake, don't get hot, said Stepan Arkadyevich, touching his brother-in-law's knee. The matter is not ended. If you will allow me to recapitulate, it was like this: when you parted, you were as magnanimous as could possibly be, you were ready to give her everything, freedom, divorce even. She appreciated that. No, don't think that.